Chapter 3. It was a house like an old Stetson hat, the crown flattened, and the back and the sides of the brim cut off, leaving a peak in front that formed an awning. There was no veranda, only earth baked hard as a cinder track, and a door frame that started at ground level. Two windows, like square blind eyes, were divided by an old brown door on which the varnish had dried and risen in blisters. Barbie knocked. There was a shuffle of feet inside. She saw a curtain draw back and a woman's face. The curtain fell quickly into place. Whether it was because the woman knew she had been seen, Barbie could not tell, but the next moment the door opened. The woman who stood in the opening was the picture of anxiety and exhaustion. Even something of fear was in her mind. Her eyes, her whole body questioned the newcomer. Barbie saw this and quickly gave the reason for her coming. The woman listened wordlessly. She was of average height, about 50, scrawny, in a print dress that ruckled under the belt around her waist. Her hair was short, untidy, black shot with gray, framing an oval face in which the cheeks had sunken and the jawbones sharpened, yet there was still something of a bloom of softness on it, and in the cloudy blue eyes there was no hardness, only sympathy and understanding. She looked as though she had toiled up a long hill with a heavy burden. "So I'll leave them with you and get on my way. If you want to write to Danny, I know he'd like to hear from you. Goodbye, Miss Shelton." "No," Miss Shelton said, some life showing in her face. "Don't go yet." Barbie looked at her, shaken with sympathy. "Come in. I want you to tell me more about him." I'll make a cup of tea." Inside, the poverty hit Barbie from all sides. It was a great box divided into rooms by burlap walls. The floor was earth, hardened with water and heat, seamed and raveled. Cooking was done in camp ovens and iron pots, in an open fireplace, with a chimney of flattened kerosene tins in the shape of a whiskey bottle. Rough shelves held canisters of biscuit, syrup, and treacle tins. The table was built of slabs, adzed smooth. 6 butter boxes, joined together and curtained with a piece of faded cretonne, formed a dresser. In one corner was a bush refrigerator, a meat safe made from a timber frame covered with sacking. While Barbie talked, more life seemed to come into Miss Shelton, and even pleasure, judging by the flickering smile that came and went on her face. She bustled more, setting cups and saucers and taking oatmeal biscuits from a tin. As she knelt on one knee on the hearth, stoking up the fire, under the billy swinging on a black hook from the crossbar, 3 of her dress buttons were undone, exposing no undergarment, only flesh and her backbone, like a knobby whip. Barbie felt touched by a rage of pity. "Miss Shelton, it's Ethel," the woman said. "Barbie, then. I'm sure I'm putting you out." You're not. Nobody comes here." "That's what I mean. I didn't come here to be a bother." "I'm glad to see you," Ethel Shelton said, and Barbie couldn't help believing that she was genuine. But the woman seemed to misconstrue the look for one of unsureness. Nobody comes here, as you say. There's nothing for them to come for, and Frank doesn't want to see anyone. But I like to see someone. I've sort of forgotten what it's like. It never used to be like this. They sat down at the table, and she poured the tea from a brown earthenware pot with a broken spout, but she had a tea cozy from other days to enclose it, and the pot looked like a headless, legless fowl of orange and black. Barbie had placed the parcel from Danny Fisher on the table, and now Ethel undid the wrapping. There was a letter in a grubby envelope. She read it slowly, preoccupied, half smiling. Then the expression changed, and she lifted her eyes, full of deep concern, and looked at Barbie. "You didn't say anything about your father." "Nothing to say. I am so sorry." She went back to the letter, lips moving, and began to read aloud. "I got him stinking, and he did the rest. I could cut my throat. It was a terrible knock for Barbie, but she'll come good in time. Do the right thing for her, Eth. Give her any help you can. She's only a pup. If she could stay with you for a bit, I'd be obliged. There wasn't no chance. Me getting down to see you, and Frank 3 years ago, but I'll come after the quacks have had a shot at me. They can cut me about all they like so long as I get out okay. As long as they leave me my pants and small change, I'll be all right. Don't worry, Chin-Chin, for the present." Barbie smiled. Sounds just like Danny. Fancy a letter from Danny, though. Ethel Shelton said. It must have nearly killed him. She turned to the things in the parcel, fumbling with them, picking them up in turn. Their value was purely sentimental, and that appeared incalculable. A pair of wooden rosary beads, each bead hand-carved, a sheaf of photographs, an old silver snuff-box, a gold watch that belonged to his father's father, 2 yellow buttons, an auburn lock of his mother's hair, and a child's hard little boot with the stubby toe turned up. Ethel Shelton suddenly put her head in her hands and cried. The tears dribbled through her fingers. Her thin shoulders shook. Barbie placed her hands on them, and at the touch of sympathy, the reaching out of understanding, the woman clasped the girl and unrestrainedly wept. "I'm sorry," she said, trying to compose herself. "You must think I'm an awful fool. Forgive me." "You're not well," Barbie said. "Why don't you go and lie down?" "No, it's not just these things. It's everything, everything. I don't know what to do." She turned her face away, wiping her eyes. "I'm tired. I'm so tired I could drop." "Are you in trouble?" She turned back, trying to smile. "Oh, it's nothing to worry you with. Have another cup of tea." She poured the tea, sniffling. "You'll stay a bit, won't you? We've got a spare stretcher in the shed, and—" Barbie wanted to help in any way she could. Help was needed. That was sufficient. But she thought Ethel Shelton was only being kind. "No," she said, "I can't stay. Danny wouldn't let me hear the end of it if you don't. You don't have to be bound by Danny's letter." "I understand," Barbie said. "I'll push on. I've got plenty to do." Ethel Shelton's hands twined on her lap. Her lips quivered. "I want you to stay, Barbie," she said soberly. "You need me." Barbie stared. "Yes," the woman nodded. "At the mercy of desperation. I need someone." "That's different," Barbie said. "I need someone I don't know what's going to happen. It must seem selfish of me to ask you, but will you stay with me and talk to me?" Her face crumpled, and she covered it with her hands. "Just for a little while." Barbie bit her lip, looking all around her at the misery and the depression, conscious of the hard little world in the big hard world, the inner and the outer, like bands around this woman, and she was aware of the challenge to her mind and spirit, and the challenge only pricked up the resolution in her and strengthened it. "You've got a mate, Ethel," she said. "Thank you," Ethel Shelton said, almost soundlessly. "Now you go and lie down, and I'll fix up here. Try and get some sleep. You look ragged." "No, I've got to get Frank's dinner." "I'll get that. Come on, don't you worry about a thing." Ethel stood up. "There's cold rabbit in the safe and some vegetables to heat up." "It'll be right." Barbie threw her coat down on top of her hat and suitcase, pushed the shirt deeper inside the waistband of her trousers, and showed that she was ready for action. "I just feel a bit churned up," Ethel Shelton said. "I'll be all right when I have a little lie down." She went. Barbie set to. The rabbit in the safe was stale and hard, 3 or 4 days old. She decided no man could eat that except as gut-wadding. She pricked it all over with a fork and soaked it in water. She got the camp oven ready to rebake it. That was the only way to make an old bunny fresh and enjoyable. The vegetables would be tastier fried, she decided, rather than reheated. She looked for flour to make fried scones. There wasn't any. The butter box dresser was nearly all space. There were 5 bottles of preserved fruit. She opened one, nectarines and syrup. She sliced up homemade bread, thinking of Bowtie Dealey, the greatest baker that ever put his hands in dough. The whole meal was ready when Ethel Shelton appeared, saying, "I see Frank coming now." When she saw the table set with clean newspapers, she exclaimed, and when she saw the bowl of nectarines, she gasped. "Oh dear, they were for Sunday. We only have fruit on Sundays," she added. "Never mind," Barbie said, "we can get more." "Oh no," Ethel Shelton said seriously, "that's the last of them." Then the door opened, and Frank Shelton appeared, with the look of a man wild and moody with thought. He was lanky and gaunt, with a face the color of coffee, and thistled with a white stubble. His eyes were big and burning, velvety. The high cheekbones and broad forehead gave him a look of intelligence. The chin betrayed weakness and sensitivity. He saw Barbie immediately. "Who's she?" he demanded, in a tone that Barbie didn't like. "Danny sent her, Frank, with some things for me. Why is she here now, then?" He seemed upset, and the words came harshly. "Nothing I asked her to stay for. She can get—" "Oh, Frank, don't go on, dear. She's a friend, and Danny—" "To hell with Danny," Shelton shouted. "What's your damn idiot of a brother doing sending her here? How'd he know where we were? Frank, listen to me. And what are you doing asking her to stay here? We don't want anybody here, you know that. You must be mad." He looked at Barbie, oblivious of the anger sparkling in her eyes. "What's the big idea coming to Cadge from us? Haven't you got anywhere to go? Drift where the grass is green. It's not green here. Frank, for heaven's sake. You can get—" That was enough for Barbie. She came around Ethel Shelton, fury on her face, her breast rising, and stood before Shelton. "Call me a cadger now. Look at me. Go on, look at me and call me a cadger now." He didn't. He swallowed. "Look at your wife. Look at you. Who do you think you are? J.C. himself. Only a half-wit would turn me away now," she told him, meaning to scald him. "And only a bastard would run out on you. I don't think you're one and I'm not the other," she added vehemently. It set him back. They stared at each other. In the lull, Ethel Shelton besought her husband to have his meal. "I don't want anything," he snapped, weakening to sulkiness. "I'm going," he shouted, turning. Barbie snarled at him. Nothing barks louder than a cur. That turned him about again, stung by the insulting remark, and more deeply by a sense of its truth. "I'm no cur," he told her, teeth gritted, holding himself back. "Then eat it," she said. "I cooked it like a woman. Eat it like a man." "Who do you think you're talking to?" He was already backing out, but needing words to save face. "I'm talking to you. I don't know you from Eve. I can put on a fig leaf and you wouldn't know the difference. I'm not used to being talked to like that." "Neither am I," Barbie said, "but I've got a hand any time you want to shake it. Come on, Frank, there's a good boy." He was glad to accept the appeal of his wife, giving the impression he was quieting under her influence, and slowly turning away. The woman let him eat, not saying a word, except to each other, mere casual conversation. They would eat afterward. Shelton finished the meal, but sat on at the table, rubbing his chin on the palm of his hand. Finally he got up and went outside. He returned with a canvas stretcher, which he placed on its end against the wall. He said to his wife, "You can make up your mind where you're going to put it." "It's all right then, Frank, long as she's prepared to make do with what we've got. I'm going back to the fence." "All right, dear." She followed him to the door. She came back shaking her head, looking apologetically at Barbie. "Poor Frank, he's not like that, you know. That's the whole rotten part about it. That's not him at all." "I'll put up your dinner," Barbie said. "Sit down." "He's changed, Barbie. He's really changed. He's damn quick on the trigger, I know that. Edgy, he's edgy all the time, ever since we came here. It's got worse, faulting me in everything I do now, and this other. I don't think you should let him push you around. I think you should be tougher with him." "Tougher? I'm sorry, I don't mean to hurt your feelings. It's not for me to say anything. I've never been married. How can I talk about another woman's husband?" Ethel Shelton became explanatory and defensive. "He's a good man, Barbie, a really good man. I'm sure you wouldn't have stuck with him if he wasn't. We've been married 22 years, you know," Ethel Shelton said, as if the information was sufficient evidence of the happiness of their life together. She went on, telling quickly the story of those 22 years, the wedding at Munta, with its Cornish miners and its green hills of copper, the honeymoon at Barossa, at the Festival of the Grapes, the Germans from the vineyards all around singing and dancing and decked out in their national costume. The standing joke, she was from a copper town and her husband from a sugar town in Queensland, so naturally everybody said they ought to be in the money. But it was never so. They battled and scratched, scraping a living from a dozen jobs, one after another. There were good starts and fine promises, but somehow they led to nothing as a full stream dwindles and loses itself in the desert. They had a child born mongoloid, which mercifully did not live long. Wherever they went, a jinx went with them, and Frank Shelton went on trying to beat it, shake it off, lose it. It wasn't that he gave in, his wife said, or ran away. It was just that he left when the odds were too great, and started anew somewhere else. As Ethel went on talking, Barbie saw that her story was not so much the story of their life together, as it was a history of the sensitivity and instability of her husband Frank. In Adelaide he got a good job, and we were paying our house off. He got pneumonia, nearly died. He lost his job. We fell behind in the payments, and the bank repossessed. We went over to East Adelaide, into a cheap house then, and a man got him work with the Shire Council at Sugarbag Flat. We were happy there and managed to get a bit of money together, but Frank wanted to do better all the time. And then he was told of this farm up for sale, cheap. A man named Ned Egan owned it. He was pretty well on and wanted to get out and go and live with his married sister at Tallam Bend. Frank was dead keen. I wasn't, but I went along with him. We bought the property, using nearly everything we had, and settled in. She stopped speaking and looked unseeingly at the floor. Of course we could not have come at a worse time. It's been hell. Whatever made him do it? It must have been uphill from the start. He thought he was doing the right thing. Barbie toyed with a fork. Has he talked about leaving? Oh no, Ethel Shelton said. To try something new, I mean. Give it away. No, he's taken a stand. He says he'll never leave. He'll see it through, even if it kills him. You mean he's going to stick it out here? But that's not like him, if all you say is true. No, it is not like him, Ethel Shelton said. She stood up. And it seems so hopeless, but he just doesn't seem to care. He has changed so much. I don't know what to do for the worry of it. The change might be for the best, Barbie said consolingly. But you've got no idea. He's afraid. Afraid. Ethel Shelton sat down again. She twisted the wedding ring on her finger, distress in her eyes. He's afraid of the wind. He thinks it's blowing him away. There was utter silence. Barbie looked at her with a mixture of astonishment and incomprehension, as though all that had gone before had been normal and trifling compared with this grave and shocking revelation. Is that honest? It wasn't a question, only a remark, certifying her consternation. He talks about it like it's some personal thing. But he seemed all right when It's not all the time, Ethel Shelton said. He'll go for days sometimes, even a fortnight. Then it'll happen. It seems to take him like a fit. He'll come running in, wild-eyed and gibbering something terrible. I've got my work cut out to pacify him, and you can't convince him. He'll fight you on it. He's got all the arguments. How do you mean? Oh, you know. I'll tell him he's being silly and just imagining things, but he'll tell me about the weight he's lost. There's a goods scales in the shed, and he's always weighing himself on that, and he'll want to know why his clothes don't fit him the way they used to. He'll think up everything he can to prove he's right. How long has he been that way? 3 months now. God, I didn't know what struck him the first day it happened. He came belting in, shut the door, and leaned against it, panting like anything. I just stared. I couldn't find my voice. Then I did. What is it? Frank, what's up? There was a look of dread and horror in his eyes. Tell me, I urged him, startled out of my wits. What's the matter? The wind, he said. It'll get us all. It'll blow us away. I asked him what he was talking about, and he screamed about the wind, and stood there helpless and shaking, distracted. I thought he'd had too much sun. I tried to get him to lie down. Then he started crying, sobbing out things I couldn't understand. Fierce things, piteous things, that's how they sounded. I got him to lie down and sat by, puzzled, until he was quiet. Suddenly he raised himself and said, Ethel, have a look. See, it is blowing. What? I said. The wind, he shouted. The wind. What else? I laughed, but he told me to shut my mouth. It was like he struck me. He was full of rage. That surprised me. I went and looked to humor him. I told him it was blowing. His shoulders slumped, and he sat there on the bed, with a strained look on his face. In a few hours, though, he was right, but he still listens. At night I wake up to hear him talking to himself, and I feel his body, and it's cold. He's in a cold sweat. Ethel, Barbie began compassionately. It's got worse. The things he says to me now. I can't do anything right. If I show sympathy, it hides scorn, he thinks. If I say a kind word, he looks for the barb in it. He suspects I'm ridiculing him, and he doesn't want me any more. I never bothered him much, but I'm starved for him now, and he doesn't want me. I get so bitter at times I could leave him. Yet he needs love and understanding, and he wants those things from me. Yes, thought Barbie, that's so clear. He's always wanted them from you, to cushion the blows that befell him, to soften his defeats, and help him in his successes. You've given him love and warmth and tenderness and understanding, and you've worn yourself out giving them to him, and if there was anything left, he's drained that off too, because his need was greater than yours. He could talk about cadgers. I don't know where it's all going to end, Ethel Shelton wondered. People are talking now too. Let them talk, Barbie Casabon said with fury. There's always fools to laugh and jeer. They come a penny a dozen. She stood up and took Ethel Shelton's worn hands in hers. Listen, this'll come out all right. Don't you fret. We'll see that it does. She coaxed a faint smile into the woman's face. Then she said, We've got no food, you know. Yes, we have, Ethel said, bread and vegetables. We can't feed a grown man on that, Barbie said. Where do you get your stores from? Tambourine. No, Rutley, storekeeper there. Colonel Finney is sticking to us. He's good, but we're not running up the tab. We have to make things spin out. I shop every fortnight. How far is Rutley? Only 7 miles, on the way to Tambourine. Is there a butcher? Yes, Ethel Shelton wet her lips. But we haven't got an account. We don't spend any money there. Well, that's all right. How do you go? Hoarse and sulky. Okay, Barbie said, dragging on her coat. I'll go in and load up. We'll turn in We'll turn it on for tea, how about that? In half an hour she was on her way, and standing beside the sagging fence, hanging onto the crowbar in the newly dug post hole. Frank Shelton saw her go. He watched her out of sight and wondered. He felt depressed, feeling the shame of his behavior, and warily angry of feeling ashamed. All his life it had gone on, action and the reaction of shame. It was all part of the process of self-belittlement, doing things and being sorry for having done them, saying words and regretting their utterance, touching life and recoiling, making mistakes and looking for pretexts, controlled by a secret, the secret of looking at himself as he was and seeing how he measured up against the man he thought he was, and the man he wanted to be, a man subject to aspiration and capitulation, in constant self-judgment, resentfully dampened and angrily prodded by the truth at one and the same time, a man who would be a better man if only he could. It seemed to him now that he was worse in himself than he had ever been. He could turn back the yesterdays like the pages of a book. There was a picture of him when he came with his wife to this land, proud of possession, and gave his heart, his soul, and his body to the earth in return for the benefits it could give. But to look upon that land was to look upon a corpse, upon the son of the widow of name awaiting life, upon Lazarus waiting to walk forth. From the shadow of his house he could see the gully, a long channel, naked as the earth you could take in your hands, blown by the wind into a baked and tawny waste. Once it was a level plain, but the heat roasted it, and the dust went in clouds from its feeble stumps and tussocks. It sagged like the grave, and a dryness sucked out its life. Its banks split and fell open like lips, and the earth crumbled into the gapes. It was the wind that did that, and now it was a melancholy monument to the wind's destruction, and the playground of the wind. And in the picture the man from his house could look upon the long furrows of his field, and the thin dust going from it all the time. He could see the sparse and wilting shoots of the struggling crop, and he knew that, like a man, the earth sweated and gasped and sent down desperately into deeper reservoirs for nutrition to carry on the struggle. Day by day it weakened, and as it weakened, the sovereign sun and the dominant wind were mightier. And there was another picture of the day of realization. It started after months of toil that lined his face and squenched his eyes, that put a cracking brown on his lips and a film of misery and desperation on his face. He was out to work, but suddenly he looked about him. The wind lifted from the hills the powder of dust. They appeared to be smoking from a fire within. The hot earth of the field swallowed and burned his ankles. The wind came about him there unseen, but the dust gave that wind a shape, a whirling shroud, a dance of brooms, a clown's hat spinning. The dust dried his palate. The wind strengthened and snatched billows of it before his eyes, and all the time the air burned in molten shimmers above the smoking hills. In that moment he was aware of it. He was aware of the wind, like a spirit that filled the sky, that was in and about and all around, that packed it as tightly as air packs a balloon, and so his world was a balloon, dominated by wind, a tyrant eager to seize and aggrandize itself on the mistakes and neglect of men, eroding plant, tree, soil, and even beast. The bullock that thinned into long jaws and ribbed sides and bony withers, the sheep whose sides dipped into panting hollows, and that died with its swollen tongue in its wedge-thin head, and with the alarm of a new and terrible thought. He looked at himself. He looked at the whipcord and sinew of his arms that once were full of muscle. He felt for the pads of flesh on his chest, and there were only articulated bones. He saw the baggy trousers hitched around his waist, resting on the clumps of his hips, and how the cloth overlapped at the waist and was flat on the belly. He felt the hollows of his cheeks and the ridgy bones underneath. He looked at his feet and was conscious of the looseness in the boots. He broke earth, stumbling. He ran in terror to the house. One day he saw a man ride through the haze, and it was Jim Kelly, a neighboring farmer. Shelton watched him coming nearer. His eyes fled all over the stringy, bean-thin form. He saw his sunken face, the color of leather. He saw the wrinkled sagginess of the neck, and the dark wells of his eyes, and he knew that the wind, too, had come upon Kelly with the knife of the whittler, had blown the desiccating heat through his blood and drawn his bones nearer to the surface. Kelly is the same, he thought, the very same, only he doesn't know it. But when he went on about it to Kelly, Kelly only peered at him in blank astonishment, and then grinned and asked him what the hell he had been drinking lately. Shelton could go from Kelly and himself to 1,000 others like him, men he had seen from Marble Bar to Wimmera, dried-out men, shadow sticks ajar with the ferocious country they took on, looking to the soil and the sky for their bread and butter, when the soil was like a barren woman, and the sky just scalded space. Shelton came back from his thoughts to the clunk of the bar in the hole. The salt sweat trickled between his lips. He wiped his face, looked about him with the air of a man on his guard, spat on his hands, and went on. Barbie returned with a sulky full of provisions, a whole bag of flour and sugar, a tin of tea. She had pumpkins and potatoes, carrots and onions. She had a whole sheep wrapped in calico, as well as some salt beef. Ethel Shelton was speechless. Her lips quivered. "Barbie, how did you do it?" "Connections," Barbie said, touched and pleased by the elder woman's delight. Inside, after they had unloaded and stored the food, Barbie gave Ethel Shelton a brown paper parcel. Her eyes were large with surprise. She wanted to know what was in it, and asking whatever could it be, all the time she was unwrapping it. Finally, it was revealed, a night dress. Wordlessly, she picked it up and turned it in her hands, her lips trembling. She held it against her form from neck to ankles. "Peach suits you. I thought it would," Barbie said. Ethel Shelton looked at her with glistening eyes. "Barbie, you're a dear. You shouldn't have." Barbie smiled. "It might help," she said sincerely. "You know." And here, this is a little bottle of Stinko to go with it." Ethel Shelton laughed through her tears. "I'll probably need help," she said pathetically. "Don't look at me then," Barbie said. "I've got my running shoes on already." Ethel laughed again and went into her bedroom with the nightgown and the bottle of scent. She started to hum, just faintly, snatches of a song. "Poor thing," said Barbie. Shelton came home in the twilight. He surprised his wife by shaving, using a cut throat and a piece of broken mirror. He was a once-a-week man. He even changed his shirt. He ate like a starved man. He didn't speak, but was content to listen to the women chattering, Barbie telling of her meeting with the folk in Rutley. What a decent stick Colonel Finney, the storekeeper, was, and the butcher, Tom Fleming, and the toothless old man she met outside the butcher's shop, wearing old trousers green as moss and a windbreaker of faded stripes, jingling pennies in his hat and grinning all over his whiskery face. He had just sold 5 shillings worth of newspapers. "That's old Harry Prince," Ethel said. "They call him the penny millionaire. Saves them pennies. Somebody'll knock him one of these days for his copper fortune. He said the rain won't be long now. Fat lot he knows," Shelton grunted, speaking for the first time. "He doesn't know what day it is." "Maybe it doesn't matter to him," Barbie said. "Maybe he wouldn't be any happier if he did know." "Rain's further away than ever," Shelton said. Barbie felt it was a leading question. He wanted to be encouraged to believe it wasn't. She succumbed wittingly. "Well, I've got a lot of faith in old men. They've had a long time to look around and add things up. And that's the second person in 2 days. The other was a drover. He said he could smell it in the wind." "Smell it in the wind," Shelton scoffed, feeding his weakness to be heartened. "Hell, what next?" "Listen," Barbie said, knowing she was being led on, but not caring. "You ever seen a string of caterpillars, nose to tail, making for higher ground? Ants, too. How do they know? They're not men," Shelton countered. "Men have got instincts too," Barbie told him. "Some more than others, like black fellers." Shelton merely nodded, as much as to say it could be right. Ethel Shelton started clearing the dishes. Barbie told Shelton she had brought some literature back from the store, the latest copy of the Mail, the Advertiser, and a couple of stale copies of the Bulletin. She got them for him. She took one of the bulletins and laughingly told him she wanted to show him a cartoon in it. She found the page and placed the journal on the table in front of him, while she stood beside him, looking over his shoulder. He felt the touch of her hair on his cheek, and out of the corner of his eye he saw the swell of her leaning breast and a smooth hip line. The cartoon showed Dad and Dave outside a shack in the glaring whiteness of sun and drought. The caption read, "By Cripes, Dad, if it don't rain soon, I'm not gonna have a white shirt for the dance." "Don't you think that's funny?" Barbie laughed. "No, I don't," Shelton said. "Nothing to make a joke about. They're not dropping their bundle anyway, are they?" Shelton looked at her quickly and darkly. Are you meaning something by that?" "I'm not meaning anything, no," she told him. Blood came into his face. "You think I'm a cur, don't you? You said as much." His big eyes, hard with light, held her as she moved around the table opposite him, anxious to take him quietly and avoid any unpleasantness, but not knowing exactly what to say. Ethel Shelton broke the tension. She said with a little nervous laugh, "Oh, Frank, Barbie didn't mean anything, and anyway, it's past. If you knew me," Shelton said, "you wouldn't think that." "Maybe I don't know you then," Barbie said. "There's such a thing as misfortune, you know." "I know," Barbie told him peaceably. "And fortune," he added. "Like some pick up dirt, and it turns to gold in their hands." "That's right. But me, there's a hoodoo on me. I pick up gold, and it turns to dirt." "Yes, but if you hung onto it long enough, maybe it'd turn to gold. Some give in before they're licked, you know." Barbie couldn't quell the upsurge of spirit in her. It was too strong and too enduring to be resisted. "You're all right. You're well off. A king with a crown compared to some." Shelton was shocked. He stared at her speechless. "You might think you're ruined. You might be ruined. But what if you are? You're not beaten. Listen, Mr. Shelton. You're older than I am, and I'm not trying to know something or tell you anything. But I'm going to tell you this. You're never beaten. God never made a weakling. The weakling made himself. Man made hardship, but God made courage, and courage is the answer to hardship, and hardships master any time." Shelton looked cornered for a reply. He burst out meaninglessly, "Who told you that?" "My father told me that, and I know it myself. Listen, I've seen them everywhere. People with their little lot in life that meant everything to them. I've seen their kids crying with hunger when the floods held up the trains, but they found food, and they were too busy for tears. The tears came afterwards. I've seen the hail come and blast the crops, and tired men looking, tired at what they had done, and tired at doing it all over again, but doing it." She placed her hands flat on the table and leaned over, deliberately staring into Shelton's face. A man trucking his few sheep, spent with the drought, had his truck break down on the stony plains. He tore off the wheels, he ripped the tubes from the tires, he cut the rubber, and with it shod his sheep, every foot, and walked them through, carrying one on his back, and he lost none. A man had nothing but all his gear, and he heard of the opal at Coober Pedy. He put his gear in a wheelbarrow and wheeled it from Tarcoola to the field over shifting sandhills for more than 100 miles. I could go on and on. Shelton dropped his eyes. His fists on the table were clenching and unclenching. Temper seethed in him. "I didn't say I was beaten." "Neither did I," Barbie said. "And I won't have you looking down on us," he stormed. "I don't look down on anybody," Barbie said calmly. "We can get on. We can make do with what we've got. You don't have to come here throwing your weight around, showing us up, bringing supplies, slinging us a handout." Barbie looked aghast. She swallowed dryly. "I never thought of it like that. You're wrong." "Frank," Ethel Shelton said, "you shouldn't say those things. You shut up. Charity. We don't want your charity." Barbie lost her temper. "You listen to me. I'm a cadger in one breath, and an almsgiver in the other. Make up your mind what I am. You can't have it two ways." Shelton propped his elbows on the table and lay his forehead in his hands. "Just leave me alone, will you? Leave me alone." Barbie said no more. She didn't want to say any more. She felt rattled and annoyed with him, with the fever of tension, and with herself, confused to know whether she should have been more restrained, less brutal. She felt sorry for him, and she wanted to tell him that. She wanted to tell him she knew he would triumph in the end, and fill him with consolation and encouragement. And feeling these things, she realized more acutely that that was what Ethel Shelton had been doing, and what she had been to this man all these years. And true to form, it was Ethel who went to him now, softly telling him that he was tired and ought to go to bed. He sat there quietly. Ethel went to her room, and Barbie went to hers, the end part of the kitchen where the stretcher had been set up. Through the burlap wall she could see the lamp in Ethel Shelton's room, like a fuzzy flower, and she saw the dim figure of the woman undressing. When she moved in front of the light, her figure was in black silhouette on the fabric. Barbie called out, "Good night," blew out her lamp, and undressed in the dark. She lay on the stretcher, open-eyed, thinking, listening to the moan of the wind around the house. She saw the night-gowned figure of Ethel Shelton pass from her room down the hall of burlap and stand at the end of it looking at her husband. "Frank, come on, dear, in a minute," he said, wearily. Barbie went to sleep. There was a man with a big hoop, made of cane and hung with little bells. He was skipping with it, slow and fast, slow and fast. The sound of the bells was a jingle, in time with the slow rhythm, and with the fast time they went jinga, jinga, jinga. Soon it was the one sound, the fast sound, and the man jumping, and the whirling hoop, and the whirling hoop, and the jumping man. Then suddenly it all stopped, with a shatter of bells, and the face of the man was close and staring out of the hoop, that was now the size of a dinner plate. Barbie's eyes flicked open. She came fully awake in an instant. Frank Shelton, in pajamas, statuesque, sat on a box 3 feet from the bed, staring at her. He was a figure of darkness, except where the glowing coals in the fireplace purpled one side of his face with a faint red and put on his glossy eyes the sheen of a treacle. Barbie sat up with fright. "What is it? What are you doing there?" The stone image didn't move. Barbie's breasts rose and fell. Her heart thumped. Then Shelton came to life. He put his hands to his head. Slowly he stood up. The words that left him came on a sob, forlorn and uttered as in a soliloquy. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he said. He turned away, and Barbie watched him go, hearing the pat of his feet on the hard earth floor, tracing him by sound, until the bed creaked as he got into it beside his wife. She heard Ethel Shelton's voice, dreamy with sleep. "Frank, you're so cold, darling. Snuggle closer to me. Let me warm you." As she heard her say, "Frank, don't you want me?" and after the long silence, "I want you, Frank," Barbie couldn't go to sleep. She lay with her eyes on the ceiling, faint in the firelight. Outside, the wind moaned. Came in gusts that braked themselves against the house with a shudder and fled around it humming. When she heard Shelton's voice, she tried to catch the words but couldn't. There was only sound, the way a man's voice comes on the wind, blown in snatches, fading and rising. She lay awake. He wouldn't do for her, not one like that, who had to be driven and led. The man that I can boss, she thought. I don't want that man. The man I want, he's got to be my master, my leader. As for Shelton, there was only the mutter of his own voice, and the boggy of the wind that he knew in all its ways. He heard it sneak up in the twilight, feigning tiredness, seeking coolness, after its hot-breathed labors of the day, and that was its insidious, deceitful method. Lying on his back in a bedroom, cold lit with dawn, he heard it rise like a stirring beast whose tail lashed the hump of Darwin, whose body bloated dominant over the heart of Australia, and whose forepaws stretched in his own backyard, and he saw it shaping its hue in the copper sky. Out of the midnight he heard its violent shrieking from the mouth of the drought, shaking his house, and to the threnody it threshed from the stooping trees, lifting the soil and blowing it out wantonly into the sea. And in the morning, though the wind had dropped, he saw the horror of its depredation in the dusty yellow light and the brazen disk of the sun. Sun and nothing but sun, no pity in the naked blue. The ball came up blood red and was white-hot flaring in the shelterless plain of the sky, and it went down in scarlet. God, for a tree in space, for a veiling cloud, to break the raw heat, to dim the brightness, let alone to encourage hope. Boiling air fuming above the corrugated iron tank. Knock the rims, and they rang with emptiness. Emptiness, that's all it was. All of it, all emptiness. These were the thoughts, and this was the talk of Frank Shelton. In the morning, after he had gone, Ethel Shelton mumbled with her wisp of a smile, "It didn't work, Barbie." Barbie made a pouting expression of sympathy, then smiled back. "Maybe I should have got apple green." "You heard him last night, did you? I hope he didn't keep you awake." "No, I slept like a top," Barbie said. She frowned. "Ethel, why doesn't he go and see a doctor? He's not well, that man. He should go." "I know, but how?" "How? You mean the money?" Ethel shook her head. "No, that's only one thing. It's the farm. He wouldn't leave here. Helen, Tommy, it's only sense. If there's something wrong with him, I told you what he said. He'll stick it out if it kills him. He means it. He's made up his mind. Wild horses wouldn't drag him away. I've given up hope. Well, I think he's heading for a tumble, and something ought to be done about it." Look, Ethel, listen. We could look after things here. He wouldn't have to worry, if he had to be away for a while, under treatment or in a hospital. Ethel Shelton went pale. The import of the words hit her hard. You don't think it's that bad, do you? I do, and so do you, don't you? No use hoping you're wrong. He's a sick man if ever I saw one. Well, why don't we do that? What I said. No, Barbie, he wouldn't come at it. I know him. A woman, not even two women, could do what it takes him, a man, to do. He'd be insulted, don't you see? Barbie saw clearly. That was his character, all right. If we were men, that wouldn't be so bad, Ethel Shelton said. Well, don't you know of any? Barbie seized on the idea. Isn't there somebody somewhere who'd lend a hand? Then you could go too with your husband. I'd help whoever it was run the show here. Ethel, think. Isn't there somebody? Ethel rummaged in her mind. Obviously, from the changing expression on her face, lining up, culling, and eliminating likely candidates. Friends, prompted Barbie. No, relatives. Ethel shook her head with finality. There's just nobody I can think of. Only that fascinatin'. And I know that's no good. She sighed. Isn't it dreadful not to have somebody you can turn to? Did you say fascinatin'? Barbie asked hesitantly. Yes, but I'm sure that's right out of the question. Fascinatin'? Queried Barbie. Is it a who or a what? Frank's half-brother, but as I say, he wouldn't. He doesn't seem to have much time for Frank, though Frank quite likes him. Barbie still had an incredulous look. And you mean to say that's his name, Fascinatin'? Ethel Shelton nodded. Well, that's what they call him. And what's he call himself? Fascinatin'. Ethel laughed. Barbie joined her. He sounded a bit of a trick, this Fascinatin'. Of course, his name is Kippelah, and his real Christian name is Jack. He's a whole lot younger than Frank. And how did he come to be called Fascinatin'? You can search me, Ethel laughed, seemingly to find it all for the first time so much of a joke. I've never had much to do with him. I only met him once. He said goodbye to us on the platform at Port Augusta when we were comin' down to Adelaide, but I've seen him 3 or 4 times in Tambourine since we came here at a distance. I don't think he'd know me again. What's he do? Oh, nothing much as far as I can make out. Picks up work now and again here and there. Seems to be a bit of a waster from what I know. Barbie laughed. And what makes him think he's fascinating? I bet he's a funny little man with bandy legs and a hump on his back who thinks he's just it. Goodness, no, Ethel told her in a half-chiding tone. He would be offended if he heard that. He's tall, 6'4" or so, and built in proportion. My, strong? Ethel Shelton laughed again. I've heard Frank say it took 4 policemen to take him down. Well, hell and Tommy, ejaculated Barbie. I think he's just our man. If he knew how it was here, he'd come for sure. No, it's no good, Barbie. He does know, and he won't help. She stood up. We're just gabbling here, and there's work to be done. But how can you be certain he won't? Because Frank asked him. When? Ethel had taken a hammer and a tin of nails from the shelf. She looked into Barbie's sincere, questioning face. 4 months ago, Frank wanted him to come in as a partner, offered him a half-share free. No go. You know what he wrote back? Too hard, too much work. That's all he said, scribbled on a torn bit of paper in a pub envelope. But that was 4 months ago. Has your husband seen him since? No, Frank wouldn't lower himself to ask him again, though he won't hear a bad word said about him. Damn him, snorted Barbie. This fascinatin' joker, I mean, who does he think he is? People need help. They need help. And if a man won't help his own brother, what sort of a man is he? Blood's thicker than water. Barbie, we'll try and think of some other way. But not this man. He's a washout, and anyway, you can't force people. They've got a right to do as they want. Yes, but blood's thicker than water. I've got to nail some tin on the shed. It's come loose. Okay, Barbie said, fuming to herself. I'll clean up in here. I'd like to clean up in a few more places too, she thought. I'd like to give this fascinatin' a kick in his big behind and make him stir his stumps. He must be a deadhead. Doesn't he have a heart? What sort of a great slob is he? Hell and Tommy, what kind of family is this anyway? One of them thinking he's being eroded along with the hills and gullies, and the other a waster and a drone giving himself airs with a fancy name, and making 4 policemen take him to jail. But it was no laughing matter about Frank Shelton. It was deadly serious. All through the next fortnight Barbie pitched in, helping, and with her very presence helping Ethel Shelton, who seemed to revive magically under the influence of her personality and companionship, as a dry root, sunned and watered, springs to shoot and flower. Shelton himself, moody and reticent, hovered as a dingo hovers on the margins of light beyond the campfire. Seemingly at times he was drawn to her and at other times repelled. God, she thought, why don't you send the bloody rain? Drive it down. That would be better than any doctor. But this ruthless day was worse than ever. The wind blew out of the boilers of the sun. The radiance pinged on the flesh. It hurt the eyes to look at the glare in the middle sky, and you had to squint down to the horizon. Yellow tonings everywhere, brown and gold and orange, cattle following the shadows of trees, wisps of white cloud, so vague as to be not there, formed in the blue, a faint tinting of the azure, a flout of nature, this as much a flout as the big black thunderclouds that banked up over the regions of drought, splitting lightning and rumbling, but going away and no rain falling. In the sky an eagle was king, and the sky was made for that soulless anchorite. Barbie came inside and sat down, looking about her, feeling her temples throbbing with the heat. The iron roof creaked. The hard earth floor was crinkled like a raisin where a mast of sunlight splashed through the doorway. A man who feared the wind, she thought, and here was his house, But here was a house of wind. Wind blew, nowhere outside. In here it was trapped, invisible as a soul in a body, but apparent against the cheek in a phantom draught, catching the dusty cobwebs in the corner, curling around the ankles, trembling on the sagging burlap walls, and when the wind blew hard the burlap billowed and bellied like sails in the currents. It fluttered when the door was open, like washing in a high breeze, the ripples running down the scrim in waves. Suddenly came the pelt of boots. The sunshine in the doorway was blotted out. Frank Shelton, like a fugitive come to refuge, slammed the door shut and stood panting against it, his eyes bolting and his face askew with the look of a madman. "We are dying, people," he screeched. "The wind'll be the death of us and get us all. Listen." His wife came running from her bedroom. "Frank, Frank," she cried, struck with the old horror and alarm again. Shelton stood stooped, his arms dangling, sweating and staring with gaping lips. "It's feeding on us, on everything. It never lets up. Frank, come and rest. There's a good boy." Ethel Shelton took his arm, uttering soothing words, but he seemed suddenly to become aware of her, and flung her away from him. She fell heavily. Barbie stirred from her trance of horror and fascination, ran to help her. The woman was moaning slightly. The breath was knocked out of her. A flood of anger, pity, and fear went through Barbie. "Wake up, you idiot," she panted. "Wake up to yourself." Shelton turned on her, snarling, "Wake up. It's you that don't wake up. You're the bitch that knows everything, every damn thing there is to be known. But you don't know this. Why don't you go and sleep it off?" Barbie wanted a quick end to it. She didn't want antagonism. "Idiot, you're the idiot. You're the one that'd bring a man to his knees and grind his face in the dirt just because it made you feel better. Frank, you don't know what you're saying. Let me put you to bed." Ethel Shelton made to rise, but Barbie's hands were on her shoulders, restraining her. "I know all right," Shelton said, his face working with passion, "laughing at me that lives with it out there as much as I live with you. You that I'm sacrificing my life for, toiling my guts out like a slave, to be laughed at and put up with. Do I have to be a corpse before you understand, with green on my grave, the only bloody green about? Do I?" "If you feel that way about it," Barbie said quietly, reasoningly, "why don't you get out?" "How?" Shelton leered, stepping toward her. "All I've got is here, all I have ever had. Where would I go? And how am I to move at all when I'm as poor as a stick? You know all the answers answer that." She didn't answer. She only looked at him and felt a pang for his vulnerability and the agony of torment in him. But her face was impassive. Shelton read into it contempt for him. He moved closer to her. She felt his breath on her cheek and saw the bloodshot veins on his eyeballs. She didn't budge. "You get out," Shelton said grimly. "Get for your bloody life. I don't want you here. I never did want you. You only stayed because it made you feel big." He started to shout, "You won't stay on here to despise me. No more. You'll go, or by God, I'll put a bullet in you." Barbie remained impassive. Shelton slowly took his eyes away from her and put a hand to his head. His hat rolled in the dirt. He staggered away, dragging great gulps of air into his heaving chest. He went down the hall. Ethel Shelton jerked out of her paralysis and ran after him. Barbie heard the sound of her soothing words. She heard the man sobbing in a way that wrung her heart. Next morning, with her bag packed, she walked down the road. Ethel Shelton went with her. "I'm sorry you're going, Barbie. I'll miss you. It's been like a holiday for me having you here. I'm not running out, you know that, don't you, Ethel? But if I make it worse for him by being here, it's best I go." Ethel started to weep. "It's dreadful, things turning out like this, and Danny thinking you would find a bit of a home with us for a while. And all that you've been through yourself, I'm ashamed." They came to the gate, and it was the parting of the ways. "I'll just walk along the road. I'll pick up a lift, don't you worry. I'll miss you like anything," Ethel said. Barbie smiled. Here she took the elder woman's hand and pressed into it 5 crumpled pound notes. "You take this." No, Ethel Shelton wouldn't hear of it. "I'll be right," Barbie said. "I've got it all worked out. I'm going to get a job in Tambourine and stick around for a bit." She patted the skinny arm reassuringly and smiled. "So we won't be far away from each other, will we? You try not to worry too much, and I'll see what I can do. I promise." Ethel Shelton couldn't speak for her emotion. When she could, it was too late. Barbie was 50 yards down the road, swinging along in a puff of dust. She stopped and turned, waving to the forlorn woman at the gate. "Don't forget to watch for the mailman," she called. She went on, shaking her head to clear her brimming eyes.